One day only had passed since Anne's conversation with Mrs. Smith, but a keener interest had succeeded, and she was now so little touched by Mr. Elliot's conduct. I'm Harriet.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're finishing off Persuasion with chapters 23 and 24. So Michael, what's your 100-word summary?
Well, I will say I thought this last two chapters were particularly difficult to summarise, but here's what I've come up with. Anne visits the Musgroves' Bath lodgings. Anne converses with Captain Harville about the qualities of men's and women's love, whilst Captain Wentworth writes a letter. The officers leave, but Wentworth quickly returns and signals to Anne that he has left her a letter. He leaves, and Anne reads Wentworth's declaration of love for her and his hopes for their future. Anne is overcome with emotion. She looks unwell, so Charles Musgrove accompanies her home, although on meeting Wentworth, he happily leaves Anne in his care. The lovers speak openly and are reconciled. This leads to a happy ending for everyone except Elizabeth.
I included some things you didn't and didn't have some things you did, which is the way it normally goes. Anne goes to the White Hart. Mrs. Musgrove and Mrs. Croft are having a conversation about why long engagements are bad. Then Anne talks with Harville about whether men or women love longer. Wentworth, who has overheard this, gives Anne a letter in which he says he still loves her. Charles is walking Anne home when they meet Wentworth. He and Anne then walk on alone, and he tells her about his feelings. That evening he asks whether he should have contacted her when he was posted to the Laconia, which is yes. In the final chapter, they're married. And I did notice that neither of us put in the Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot outcome.
Well, there were so many things that I had to remove.
So just before we start talking about these last two chapters, I wanted to make a quick comment about where it sits in world events, because we know that this final visit to the White Hart and Elizabeth's party in the evening happened on a Saturday. Yeah. And I've found a timeline for Persuasion online. It seems pretty likely that this Saturday is Saturday the 25th of February. Now, on Sunday the 26th of February, Napoleon escaped from Elba and headed for Paris, where he arrived on the 1st of March. Jane Austen deliberately set it in February. No one in the book knows that Napoleon is about to escape from Elba.
No.
But the readers of the time do. So did anyone else have anything general about the chapters, or will we just start at the beginning?
I think, to state the obvious, what's striking is how different and how so much more satisfactory this ending is compared to the cancelled chapter that we talked about previously.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think both of it, the chapter we talked about last time and this chapter, both of which replace the cancelled chapter, they've got so much more depth and character and power to them than the cancelled chapter did. It's such an improvement and such an insight into her writing process.
Yes.
Well, I think what's so strikingly different is how much agency Anne has in these chapters compared to her much more passive role in the original ending, and the ways in which these chapters focus much more on both what she is feeling and on what Wentworth is feeling.
But let's start with where Anne arrives at the White Hart, and because the rain stopped, Mary and Henrietta went out, but they left the strictest injunctions with Mrs. Musgrove that Anne must wait until they come back.
It just shows that more and more the Musgroves have taken Anne into the centre of their family.
And also this little picture you get that, Mary is always complaining and everything, but at the same time, she and Henrietta have gone out shopping together. It's just a reminder that for all Mary's problems and her prickly personality, the Musgrove clan has included Mary, and it's a very tight clan.
I had a slightly different take on that, in that whilst I agree with what you were saying, I'd also say that for me there's a hint that Mary in particular believes that Anne has no other purpose in life than to wait for her.
Well, I suppose there's that, but I still saw it as they want Anne to be with them.
Yes, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
So the next thing that happens is the conversation between Mrs. Musgrove and Mrs. Croft about Henrietta and Charles Hayter, saying it's better for them to get married straight away, even if they have to struggle a bit, because there's nothing they dislike so much as a long engagement or an uncertain engagement. Both Anne and Wentworth are overhearing this and both feeling how relevant it is to them. And it's Mrs. Croft who says she's particularly down on an uncertain engagement. And it sounds like even she would have given the same advice to Anne as Lady Russell did. You don't want to enter into an engagement yet. So is this to set us up, having all the way through thought this advice was bad, to think actually maybe it wasn't so bad?
Well, it could be, couldn't it? Yes. Or is she just bringing up the question, which they've both been thinking about anyway, but they're thinking about it even more now?
Yeah.
Was he right to be so disapproving of Anne?
I kind of think because Mrs. Croft is so lovely, we have to take her views as morally right.
Yes, she has been positioned as someone who's sensible with some moral authority. I will say, for me, this comes across as an unusually heavy-handed intervention into the plot in a way that I don't normally expect from Jane Austen, and it doesn't land very well for me because of that.
It doesn't really bother me, but you're probably right that it's a bit surprising it happened.
While the conversation in and of itself is maybe a little bit convenient, it's been properly set up. It's not out of the blue. Henrietta and Charles Hayter are getting married, and he still doesn't properly really have a confirmed lifetime position.
Yes.
Yes, I know. Just at least on this rereading, I found it a bit heavy-handed.
I can see your point of view, but for me it fits well.
Well, I had no problems with it.
The next thing that happens in the chapter is Captain Harville calls Anne over and they have their conversation. And I genuinely think this is not just the most romantic scene in Jane Austen. For me, it's the most romantic scene in all of English literature, but most of the romance component of it comes in retrospect because you don't realise at the time that everything Anne is saying is being overheard by Wentworth. While we've talked before about how Anne is much more proactive, which she is, she has far more agency in these Bath chapters than she did earlier in the book, but this conversation with Captain Harville, it is not directed at Wentworth. At the concert, she moved her seats around so she could talk to him more easily. This is just her basically speaking from the heart to Captain Harville.
Yeah.
And it's such a wonderful conversation. And then we learn later that Wentworth heard it all and that was the trigger for him. And I just think it's awesome.
Yes, I agree. I suppose she must be conscious that Captain Wentworth is...
No, at first she isn't. When he drops his pen, she realises he's closer than she thought he was. And yes, maybe at that point she does think or hope Wentworth might be hearing her, but not from the start of the conversation.
Fair enough. I don't think that it's performative. I don't in any way want to imply that she's saying this with the hope that Captain Wentworth is hearing. I believe it's utterly sincere, and I agree that it's one of the great scenes in English literature, romantic or otherwise.
Yes, it's absolutely wonderful and beautifully written and fits in with the characters.
I absolutely love the bit where Harville talks about, if I could make you comprehend what a man suffers when he takes a last look at his wife and children, and then he says, and then when he gets back and he's obliged to put into another port and he works out how long it will be before they can be there, and he tries to tell himself that it'll take longer so that he can be surprised when they arrive sooner. I think that's just lovely. Then Anne has her line about loving longest when all hope is gone. Then after that conversation, Wentworth and Harville leave, and then Wentworth comes back and says he's forgotten his gloves, and that's when he pushes the letter towards her, and then she reads the letter. And this is not the popular opinion, but I think the letter itself is far less romantic than the scene that's gone before it. I think the phrase, "you pierce my soul," is needlessly histrionic. I don't think this is the best letter in Jane Austen, and in fact, thinking about it, I don't even think this is the best letter in the book, because I think Mary's letter to Anne, on a completely different tone, is such a good letter. As I said, this is not the popular opinion, and people are probably going to hate me for it. But while I don't dislike the letter, and there are certainly some good bits in it, as a declaration of love, I would probably say Knightley's "If I Loved You Less, I Would Be Able to Speak About It More." It has more power in those few words than the letter. But having said that, obviously it's crucial for the chapter. You couldn't have the chapter without the letter. But every time I read "You Pierce My Soul," I think, ugh.
Well, harsh.
This is Wentworth, who talks like an intelligent, educated man, but not in these romantic terms. He's trying to sort of do a Sir Walter Scott, which is then a bit forced for a letter that's supposed to be revealing his soul.
I think this is an outpouring of emotion, and therefore, I'm sorry, it's going to be emotional. It may include some exaggeration.
I'm not saying the letter shouldn't be there. It's just everybody says how wonderful and romantic and amazing the letter is, and for me personally, it just doesn't do it in that way. Anne is then, of course, completely overcome by this letter. I noticed Michael used the word overcome in his 100-word summary. I had also used that word, although I then cut it when I was trying to cut back to 100 words. She just needs a bit of peace and quiet to process it, which of course you don't get when you're surrounded by the Musgrove clan.
And demonstrates that Anne completely disagrees with you about the letter.
Yes. Again, we get this lovely picture of Charles is perhaps limited in understanding, but a fundamentally nice person when he is so willing to give up his appointment with the gunsmith to walk Anne home because he can see that she needs it.
Yes.
Then that great scene of them encountering Captain Wentworth on the street, and so that's when they have their time alone and they walk along the gravel walk.
And they analyse or report to one another what they felt.
Yeah. We get almost a summary of key events of the book from Wentworth's point of view.
Yes.
A slightly revisionist one, perhaps.
Yes.
He says that he thought himself to be indifferent and didn't realise that he wasn't at first.
The thing that I wanted to talk about is Wentworth having that feeling he's got a moral obligation to marry Louisa.
After Louisa's fall on the steps in Lyme, he suddenly realises that people like Harville think he is engaged to Louisa, and even though he could tell Harville, "No, I'm not engaged," he suddenly has this sense of obligation to Louisa.
Well, I just sort of wondered how that plays out. Should he feel that politeness tells him he should marry Louisa when he doesn't want to? He's in love with Anne. Obviously, Anne needs him more than Louisa does. It's a very dicey situation.
What Wentworth says is, "I began to reflect that others might have felt the same. Her own family, nay, perhaps herself, I was no longer at my own disposal. I was hers in honour if she wished it. I had been unguarded. I had not thought seriously on this subject before. I had not considered that my excessive intimacy must have its danger of ill consequence in many ways." It's almost like he's thinking that he's going to have to marry Louisa as a punishment for behaving inappropriately earlier.
That's a bit hard to punish himself. He's got to also punish Louisa, who gets a husband who will resent her, and Anne, who doesn't get a husband.
Well, what he's probably thinking, though, I mean, you said earlier Anne needs him and Louisa doesn't. But Anne has been coping quite well without him for 8 years,
Indeed.
as far as he knows. And Louisa has just suffered a terrible injury and may, in fact, have been expecting his proposal. I don't think he would necessarily be thinking of it in terms of Louisa will suffer in having a husband who doesn't love her. He'd just be thinking, well, I owe it to her
Yes,
because I've set up expectations.
I mean, it's an exact parallel of Sense and Sensibility, really.
What you have is Edward's personality and Henry Crawford's actions, because Henry Crawford deliberately tries to make the women fall in love with him without any intention of following through.
Yes.
Edward has involved himself and become formally engaged and then refuses to break it off, but it is a
Yes.
formal engagement, if secret.
In that sense, it's a sort of parallel situation.
But also, of course, then we get the fact that he's accepted that he may have created these expectations and he's freaking out about it and thinking he's trapped. But then he thinks, well, I'll do whatever I can by fair means to make her forget me. So he doesn't see her when she's in the sick room and he finds these excuses to go away. But he's all the time thinking, well, yeah, I may have to go back and marry her.
I think what he's saying is that he came to this state of realising he'd got himself into this situation. What did most men do? They disappeared. And everyone thought it's over, they're not coming back. We cannot pursue them and say, you committed yourself.
Basically, he's ghosting her.
Yes.
But of course, he does say that if necessary, he was hers if she wished it and he would come back. He's just hoping he won't have to.
Yes.
I think there's an aspect of this that you're leaving out. So while he's flirting earlier in the novel, he's in his I'm still angry at Anne phase. And one might almost suggest it's a kind of performative.
That basically some of his flirting with Louisa is a subconscious statement to Anne.
He's effectively saying, you rejected me, but see, other women are attracted to me. It's to some extent performative. But then after the events in Lyme, he starts to move out of that being angry with Anne and starting to appreciate her qualities, whilst perhaps also at the same time, and I think this is where the revisionism might be coming in, is his eyes are opened as to just how silly the Musgrove girls are.
Well, the revisionism is also when he says how his brother didn't suspect how, in my eyes, you could never change. And we know from earlier in the book that he precisely said she was so changed he wouldn't have known her.
Yes.
And yes, that comes partly from bitterness, but...
Yes.
Then he talks about his feelings through Bath, which it turns out were pretty much what Anne was suspecting they were.
Yes. And also that now how much he's enjoying telling all about what he was feeling. Yes.
Well, we kind of had that with Elizabeth and Darcy as well, except Wentworth was feeling all of this while Anne was watching him and interpreting it, whereas Darcy was feeling all of it and going through it off the page.
So are we suggesting that this is Jane Austen endeavouring to do a better job than she did in Pride and Prejudice? Which I would certainly agree with.
I think it is far better that Wentworth is here for most of the book. Not all of the book. There is a chunk in Bath when he's not. But Wentworth is far more present throughout the book than Darcy is present throughout Pride and Prejudice. And in particular, Darcy's key period of change happens completely off stage, whereas we see Wentworth's key period of change. I don't think it's Jane Austen trying to fix Pride and Prejudice, because I am perfectly happy with Pride and Prejudice, whereas I do in some ways think Anne is a revisiting of Eleanor and trying to do it better.
Indeed.
The chapter finishes off with this final conversation between Anne and Wentworth at the card party, but they found their little private space when they're admiring this greenery, where Anne basically says, although Lady Russell's advice may have been wrong, I was right in yielding to it because otherwise I would have suffered in my conscience. And then Wentworth has his bit about, when I had returned to England in the year 8 with a few £1,000s and was posted into the Laconia, if I had written to you, would you have answered my letter? Would you, in short, have renewed the engagement then? And her answer is, would I?
So I think it's so important and so revolutionary compared to Jane Austen's other novels that we have him actually say, "Good God," he cried, "you would. It is not that I did not think of it or desire it, as could alone crown all my other success, but I was proud, too proud to ask again." In this conversation, it is him declaring self-awareness, declaring not only that he was wrong for resenting her in the first place, but recognising that because he held on to this bitterness for so long, he has only himself to blame.
For 6 of those 8 years.
Exactly. And I think that is just superb. And it makes him a three-dimensional character in a way that, in my opinion, no other male hero in Jane Austen is.
The final chapter in the book is just a wrapping up of everything.
There's part of me that imagines Jane Austen having written the chapter we've just been talking about and recognising it was so good. And then she goes, okay, there are all these loose threads. Let me get them over and done with as quickly as possible.
That's not quite right, though, because there was a cancelled version of this chapter that is actually very similar.
Okay.
So a lot of this chapter is Anne and Wentworth get married and let's see how everybody else reacts to it, which is delightfully character focused. But we also get this somewhat unexpected and sort of tossed off a bit briefly resolution of Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot, which is that she goes off with him and is next heard of living in London under his protection, and she'd thrown over her chances at Sir Walter to try for the younger man, and maybe she'll get him in the end. And does anyone really think Mr. Elliot will marry Mrs. Clay in the end, other than the makers of the most recent Persuasion film?
But I think Jane Austen probably has seen quite a number of women who lived with a man, then managing to marry him. And perhaps she thinks it's a toss-up.
Henry Crawford doesn't marry Maria Bertram post her divorce. And Mr. Elliot is even more self-interested than Henry Crawford. But then the other thing in this chapter, as I said, is everyone else's reactions to the marriage of Anne and Wentworth, which is generally positive. Lady Russell comes to terms with it and admits that she was less insightful than her young friend. So Walter recognises that actually Captain Wentworth isn't at all bad looking, so he's quite happy to write his name in the baronetage.
Yeah. But then presumably he was a very attractive 20-something-year-old as well. But it's the fact that he is successful, he is going to become an admiral, because he's now reached the point that he only has to keep living to become an admiral.
Yeah, it actually says, Captain Wentworth, with £25,000 and as high in his profession as merit and activity could place him, was no longer nobody. He was now esteemed quite worthy to address the daughter of a foolish spendthrift baronet who had not principle or sense enough to maintain himself in the situation in which Providence had placed him, and who could give his daughter at present but a small part of the share of £10,000 which must be hers hereafter. That he also likes the fact that Captain Wentworth is good looking, and so he can write his name in the baronetage.
Yes.
And Mary likes the reflected glory and is particularly happy that Captain Wentworth is richer than either Captain Benwick or Charles Hayter. And just so long as he doesn't get made a baronet, she'll be happy. The notes in my Cambridge edition do say it was quite unlikely he would make a baronet because there weren't so many being made after this point.
I was going to say that.
But yeah, Mary's happy in such a very Mary sort of way.
Yes.
So it's really only Elizabeth who's suffering. So that's the end of Persuasion. Favourite sentences. This time I'm going to start with my favourite sentence because I strongly suspect that these chapters we are all going to actually have the same first choice for favourite sentence. And so I'm going to claim the privilege of being the editor of this podcast and say my favourite sentence is when Anne says, "All the privilege I claim for my own sex, it is not a very enviable one, you need not covet it, is that of loving longest when existence or when hope is gone." Because I feel that sums up everything that is so beautiful about Persuasion.
If Harriet hadn't already read it out, that would be my favourite sentence. It's certainly the sentence that has stayed with me longest from the book. But to come in second, the favourite sentence I've got is one of the ones from Captain Wentworth when he's explaining his past. "Here," said he, "ended the worst of my state, for now I could at least put myself in the way of happiness. I could exert myself, I could do something." And this is the favourite bit. "But to be waiting so long in inaction, and waiting only for evil, had been dreadful. Within the first 5 minutes, I said, I will be at Bath on Wednesday, and I was."
Well, I too, of course, had Harriet's choice as my first choice. So I have chosen one which Harriet has already referred to earlier, and that is around Mary's views on the marriage. So the one I have chosen is, "If they could but keep Captain Wentworth from being made a baronet, she would not change situations with Anne."
Ah, well, lovely different tone.
But that is so Mary.
Yes.
Yes.
See, Mary is such a good character.
Indeed.
Yes.
The character we're talking about today to finish our Persuasion series is Anne Elliot, who is my absolute favourite of the Jane Austen heroines, and she was one of the characters I wrote about in my honours thesis when I was at uni, because I was focusing on the three characters who are all in what I called the Patience on a Monument situation of being in love with a man who, for whatever reason, they believe they can never be with. And I really feel that Anne Elliot is like a much more successful version of Eleanor Dashwood, because Fanny Price is a little bit different because she is so put upon by her family that it has eroded her self-confidence down to practically nil. Whereas Anne, in spite of being put upon by her family, still has more self-confidence and more ability to engage with people, as does Eleanor. Eleanor and Anne both, in spite of what they're feeling inside, they go through with all their social obligations, they behave properly in company. But I think the real message that you particularly get with Anne, and you might not have got so strongly with Eleanor, is that for all this behaving properly and exercising self-command over your emotions, it doesn't stop your ability to feel. And that's what we get all the way through Persuasion. We know Anne's emotions in a much deeper sense, I think, than we get with any of the other heroines.
Yes, I agree. She is a more rounded character. She is the oldest of Jane Austen's heroines. And that's important because this becomes a novel about that lived experience and how that lived experience has shaped her in a way that is not true of any of the other novels. And I'm wondering whether it's true of any character in any novel before this.
I haven't read enough novels.
No, I know, but it's certainly strikingly different to characters in 18th century or even other contemporary novels. So she is a more complex character, and we get such a deep and rounded insight into Anne in the way that is not true, in my view, of any of the other heroines.
One thing that actually just occurred to me while you were talking, and I'd never really thought of it before, is looking at Anne and Fanny. One of the things about Fanny is she is very, very judgmental, and that puts a lot of people off, particularly if they don't necessarily share her moral view of the world. But
Yeah.
She's incredibly judgmental. Anne, however, is also quite judgmental of people, but she's indulgent with it. She does
what
feel
you're
herself...
sort of saying is they're both interested in character, but they have a different approach to it.
No, I'm more just thinking of Anne's attitude towards the Musgrove girls in particular, but also to Mary and also to Charles, is she sees their faults. She feels herself inside. She feels comfortably superior to them. She judges them and she may be critical of them, but she is also accepting of them. Whereas Fanny doesn't necessarily think, I'm better, but absolutely thinks, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. She's very judgmental in a way that Anne isn't, but Anne is still, in her own way, also judgmental of other people.
Yes, she is judgmental and sees their faults, but that doesn't stop her having an affectionate relationship with them.
Yeah, she's accepting of them with their faults. Not long after the most recent film adaptation of Persuasion came out, where the Anne Elliot in that adaptation bore no relationship to the Anne Elliot of the book, there was a YouTube video called Why Does Hollywood Hate Gentle Characters? And I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And is Anne a gentle character? She's a quiet character. The story is about her internal life. But is she gentle?
Yes, she's quiet. One might say at the beginning of the novel she's introverted even. As you've already said, she's not gentle in the sense of just instantly forgiving things that people do.
Actually, I think I don't find Anne a very interesting character. But the other thing with what you're saying about a gentle character, I think Anne is the sort of character perfectly able to tell off a housekeeper.
If the housekeeper was skimming off money, if the butler was drinking, I think she would manage that.
She would have a proper lady of the house way you speak to butlers. We wouldn't know what it was.
Yes. It would not be like Mrs. Norris speaks to people, I don't
Oh,
think.
no. She is capable of doing all the things that Mrs. Norris does, but she would have done them in a different and better way.
Yes, I was going to say she would be much more effective because rather than simply abusing them like Mrs. Norris.
She'd be very competent at that sort of thing.
I mean, for a lot of people, Elizabeth Bennet is their favourite heroine and Anne is too quiet for them. But I know other people, and one example is Scott Stevens, the radio personality who's talked to the Jane Austen Society. He believes Anne Elliot is Jane Austen's most mature creation.
Well, she's the last, isn't she?
So you've said you don't find her very interesting. Why do you not find her interesting?
I'm shocked that you said that.
No,
No,
I
no
was just
judgment.
thinking then, when I had to say, what do I like about Anne? You know, I like reading about her. I like the part she plays in the book. But, well, put her beside Fanny and the extent to which I think about her compared with the extent I think about Fanny or Eleanor or Marianne, even though, you know, they're very different sort of characters. I really don't think about Anne much at all. I mean, you know, she's doing the ideal second daughter.
Well, I suppose Anne doesn't really undergo any growth in the book because all of that happened before the book started.
I'm not sure that's true.
Well, I suppose like Fanny and Eleanor, and unlike Elizabeth, Emma, Marianne and Catherine, she never has a point where she has to say, I was wrong, I must do better.
Yes.
So I would agree in terms of her moral compass that she doesn't change, but in her engagement with the world and her place in the world and her understanding of herself, I think she grows considerably through the novel. We see Anne go on a voyage of self-discovery and coming to terms with who she is and her place in the world that I think is quite different from the very withdrawn Anne of the beginning of the novel.
See, I think that is not a change in Anne. I think it is a change in context. And I think before the book started, every previous time she went to stay at Uppercross, she was the same as she is when we see her now, because Uppercross is an environment that enables her to be herself, whereas Kellynch is an environment that crushes her. It's not that she changes, it's that we see her responding in increasingly significant situations. So her reaction when Louisa falls is actually no different, really, to her reaction when little Charles has his fall. It's just that it's bigger and more significant.
Throughout the novel, she's the one who can react most quickly in an emergency.
If you're only saying she would know what to do if someone had an accident, that's not what the book is about. The book is about her emotional growth, her understanding of herself as a person, and I think that that is fundamentally different at the end of the novel than it is at the beginning.
See, I don't agree. I do think that she is a different person in different contexts, because what's the point in trying to assert yourself in Kellynch, because she has no control over her father and sister. But when she's at Uppercross, it's not like she has grown as a person between Kellynch and Uppercross. She behaves differently at Uppercross because she's been to Uppercross before and she knows the circumstances in Uppercross.
If that's the case, then what's the point of the novel? There's no journey in the novel.
The plot of the novel is bringing Anne and Wentworth together, and Wentworth realising that Anne's the person he really did admire.
Yes, but that's only possible because they both change through the novel.
I don't think Anne changes during the novel. Lovely things happen to Anne during the novel, but I don't think her personality changes. Do you, Harriet?
No.
The change is developing greater self-awareness and greater self-confidence to take her place and not be pushed to the side in the way that she has been through the entire novel.
She doesn't need to develop self-awareness. She has self-awareness.
Do you think she's
Yeah, I think she's very confident within herself. I just think what we see in the novel is she is able to express her personality in an outward way that she was not able to do before because of the circumstances she was in. I just don't believe her underneath personality changes in any fundamental way. What's the novel about? The novel is about her escaping her evil father and evil sister.
Yes, but she has to go through a journey that changes her in order for that to happen.
I think basically we're just going to have to agree to disagree on this. We have two different points of view on it, but ultimately I think it still means we find Anne an interesting character.
You each think you're right, and why not? Why shouldn't you have two different readings of the same wonderful book?
I should add that this conversation went on for way, way longer, and I have edited it right back.
For the historical section this time, Harriet has asked me to talk about the Royal Navy in 1815 and beyond. So, as Harriet has already pointed out, Persuasion is set in 1814 and 1815, during the period of peace following Napoleon Bonaparte's first abdication. So I thought I'd start by talking about the Royal Navy's role during the 100 Days campaign, the time between Napoleon's escape from Elba and his final defeat after Waterloo. The first thing I have to say is that the Royal Navy's role in the 100 Days was vital, but completely unspectacular. There were no major and indeed precious few minor naval engagements during the 100 Days. Nonetheless, the Royal Navy's absolute superiority at sea was a key component in ensuring the Allied victory was swift and absolute. So essentially, the Royal Navy's primary role during Napoleon's 100 Days campaign was blockading, ensuring not only that the French Navy couldn't attack Britain and its shipping, but also ensuring that the French could not import supplies to support their war effort.
So the book finishes, well, that Saturday when they finally get back together is just before Napoleon's escape and therefore right at the very start of the 100 Days. Do you have any sense of how soon after that event Wentworth would have been called back to the Navy?
So after the news broke and once it reached the Admiralty in London, they have to now reverse what they'd begun doing at the beginning of the novel. In other words, large numbers of ships were essentially being mothballed and their crews are being dismissed and their officers are being sent off onto half pay. So now they have to quickly try and reverse that. They send what ships they have, which are already considerable, back to sea, and they also start frantically trying to recommission these ships, recrew them, and send them back out to renew the blockades. So, given his fighting reputation, it's not entirely implausible to imagine Captain Wentworth would have received orders calling him back from half pay to take over command of a ship in one of the blockading squadrons, or even perhaps a frigate to patrol against French commerce raiders. It is, however, more likely that he would have been called back to recommission either the last ship he was commanding or another one, and therefore, like most naval officers recalled, probably spent most of the 100 days re-equipping his ship and not getting to sea until everything was over. So, anticlimax.
Except Anne, of course, is suddenly feeling all naval wife, which she thought she'd never
well,
have.
Except
no.
she couldn't be a naval wife yet, because unless they got married the next week.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
right.
She
well,
is
a naval fiancé then.
Yeah. She's panicking because let's remember that this war has been going on more or less continuously throughout their entire life, and they didn't know at that point that this was only going to last 100 days.
Yes.
And the key point is, one of the reasons that it only lasts 100 days is because of the Royal Navy. So while the decisive battle of the campaign took place on land at Waterloo, the Royal Navy's command of the seas left Napoleon with no options but unconditional surrender. Surrounded and with no escape possible on July 15, 1815, Napoleon boarded the HMS Bellerophon and surrendered to its naval captain Frederick Maitland. We're now moving into what becomes called the Pax Britannica. From the end of the Waterloo campaign to the beginning of the First World War, Britain becomes the absolutely dominant world maritime power. So to give you an example of how dominant they are, throughout this period, the British maintained a navy more than twice the size of any other country. This absolute dominance of the world's seaways was the cornerstone of British imperial power. It not only allowed them to maintain an empire on which the sun never set, but also gave them the ability to impose their will on countries great and small around the globe. So, what came next? More or less immediately after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade became a very strong focus for the Royal Navy from this time right up to the time of the American Civil War. But we also have to say that the Royal Navy absolutely deserves credit for its massive reduction of the transatlantic slave trade. We also need to acknowledge that they continued to allow certain countries to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. So both the Portuguese and Spanish continued in the transatlantic slave trade, and they were untouchable by the Royal Navy because of the treaties between the countries. So, as I said earlier, the Pax Britannica period of essentially a century saw no major sea battles, simply because British naval dominance was so great that no country would seek to seriously challenge them at sea until the German Empire at the very end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Nonetheless, the Navy played a vital role in conflicts throughout the 19th century, including the Opium Wars with China, the Crimean War in 1854 and 1855, and the suppression of the Indian Rebellion in 1857. And yes, I am very conscious that pretty well all those conflicts we now see in a very different light than they were seen at the time. In these and many other smaller conflicts, their roles included destroying enemy shipping and coastal infrastructure, transporting troops and supplies, as well as landing naval brigades made up of sailors and marines supporting the army, as they did, for example, during the siege of Sebastopol, during the Crimean War. They also constantly patrolled the world's sea lanes, fighting pirates and defending British trade interests.
At what point had they changed from sail to steam?
Yes, this period also saw the birth of the steam age at sea. The Royal Navy's first steamship was HMS Comet, launched in 1822, and in 1824 HMS Lightning accompanied another expedition to Algiers.
So those are well within Wentworth's time in the Navy.
Yes. Steam vessels appeared in greater numbers through the 1830s and 40s, and the first major steam warship, or ship of the line, was HMS Agamemnon, launched in 1852. These ships retained a full capacity for sail, as steam engines were not yet efficient enough to permit long ocean voyages solely under steam power. Steam power was intended only for use during battle and to allow ships to go to sea at will instead of being held in port by adverse winds. So what might all this mean for the potential later career of Captain Wentworth? Well, possibly very little. Although the end of the novel seems to imply that he will continue in his naval career, it is worth pointing out that the massive oversupply of post-captains in this period meant that all naval officers, no matter how successful, inevitably would spend a significant proportion of their time at home on half pay. Of course, Wentworth's prize money would ensure that this state would be much more comfortable for him than it would be for the majority of post-captains. But assuming that he doesn't contentedly stay on half pay for the rest of his life, and that he does go to sea, what roles might Captain Wentworth look forward to? Well, first and foremost, particularly in the short term, Wentworth, like all naval officers, would hope for command of a ship. And his fighting record, not to mention his family connection to a member of the Admiralty, would give him a better than average expectation of getting one. No doubt he would hope for command of another frigate, as these nimble, fast vessels were most likely to see action during the Pax Britannica rather than larger ships of the line. On the other hand, the small size and consequent lack of amenities and privacy would make it quite difficult for him to have Anne on board a frigate. It was relatively rare for naval officers to have their wives on board at all. It was more or less unheard of for them to do so unless it's in a larger vessel, a ship of the line, or a transport. So, as one becomes more senior, then one's ambitions move from the command of a single ship towards broader commands, what is usually referred to as station commands. And in fact, even before his seniority inevitably saw Captain Wentworth become Admiral Wentworth, he might hope to be made a Commodore. These days, in modern navies, Commodore is an actual rank between Captain and Rear Admiral. In this period, it's an appointment by which a senior post-captain essentially becomes an acting Rear Admiral in command of a squadron of ships, usually a smaller squadron of ships than would be commanded by an admiral. So becoming an admiral and being promoted beyond captain is entirely around seniority. It doesn't matter what you do from that point, provided you're still alive, you are going to be made an admiral. And as those above you in the list die, you are going to go up the ranks of admiral. However, as I've already said, even successful naval officers spent much of their time on half pay. But it is worth pointing out that half pay captains and admirals had many potential career options outside the Navy. Firstly, wealthy officers such as Wentworth were very likely to buy a country estate and spend much of their time as a country gentleman. It was also not uncommon for naval officers to combine their naval careers with becoming a member of Parliament.
But they didn't get paid for that.
They did not get directly paid for that. Most of them managed to make very handsome livings out of that. Another option for Captain Wentworth, albeit a less common one, might be, as a number of half-pay officers did, to join scientific expeditions, commanding exploration vessels for organisations such as the Royal Society or the Royal Hydrographic Society, or even wealthy individuals. The Royal Navy was relatively accommodating of this. In fact, they quite encouraged it, as they recognised that the results of such voyages were often of direct benefit to them. That's particularly obvious, I think, in the case of the Hydrographic Society, going out mapping the world's sea lanes, ocean currents. So these are clearly of significant strategic importance to the Navy. Last but by no means least, a good number of naval officers ended up as colonial governors or in other senior imperial governmental positions. For example, the first 4 governors of New South Wales, the place where we are all speaking from now, Arthur Phillip, John Hunter, Philip King and William Bligh, were all captains of the Royal Navy. It also should be said that port admirals were often effectively the governors of the areas where they were based, because they were the highest ranking British official.
Yes.
So I think it is important to recognise, even during wartime, but particularly during the Pax Britannica, the extent to which a Royal Naval officer's role is at least as much a diplomatic one as a military one.
I'm just sort of thinking, of course, if Wentworth had been made governor of somewhere all over the world, there should be the governor's lady.
Yes, exactly.
So for the final pop culture section, I'm going to talk about novelisations that have put Persuasion into a modern context. When I looked up on Goodreads for modern versions of Persuasion, it gave me a list of 72 books. I have not read all of these. I have read a few, and it is going to be a very quick whistle-stop tour through them. But first of all, I just wanted to very, very briefly talk about a book that doesn't exist. You remember, for a lot of the earlier books we've talked about, I've mentioned the Austen Project, which got well-known authors to write modern versions of Jane Austen novels. They did Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma and Northanger Abbey, but they didn't do Mansfield Park or Persuasion. And while it would never have happened, because he's probably far too busy and important, I would love to see a modernised version of Persuasion written by Kazuo Ishiguro, because the books of his that I have read often seem to have lost chances as a key theme, and I think that ties in so well to Persuasion. But sadly, I don't think we'll see him writing a Persuasion modernisation anytime soon. So, of the books I have read, most of them tell the backstory of Anne and Wentworth in a series of flashbacks that is spread throughout the book. So the first one I looked at was published in 2000. It's called Persuading Annie by Melissa Nathan. It's set in the UK, but the Travelling to Bath equivalent is in the US. In this book, the two characters were together when they were at uni, and then there is a 7-year gap before they meet up again. It is trying to be a quite close parallel to the original book in that most of the characters in Jane Austen's work do have equivalents in this book. Just 2 points I really wanted to make with it. One that was interestingly different is she spends most of the book being angry with him, which of course is not something we get in Persuasion. And another thing that I thought really cute is that the big interest of Charles's life is playing golf, which I thought is such a good parallel to Charles going out and shooting all the time.
Yes.
The next one I read is from 2017. There's actually been quite a rush of them in relatively recent years. It's called Modern Persuasion by Sarah Marks. Again, the Anne and Wentworth equivalents were together at college, but this time there's been a 10-year gap. And again, most of the characters from the original book have equivalents, although it's quite a different family dynamic, because in this case, Walter has not actually properly gotten over the death of his wife. Anne is managing everything, but she's actually supported by Mary, who's rather needy but quite nice. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is a real piece of work. The context of this is they run a publishing company. He's written a book that is being published through their company, and they're going on sort of the publishing tour together. In this one, in the equivalent of the letter, he retells the whole story from his point of view, which of course in the chapter we read today we get from Wentworth, but it's happening in the conversation. He doesn't put it all in the letter. The next one is from 2020, and it's called Recipe for Persuasion by Sonali Dev. This is one in the series of 4 books she's written about an expatriate Indian family living in the USA. I hadn't discovered them when we were doing Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, but I did talk about the Emma one last season. This one, Recipe for Persuasion, is the second in the series. So in this case, the two characters were together at school, and there's a 12-year gap. She runs a restaurant, he was a famous footballer, and they come together at a cooking reality show. Now, this is quite different because the whole book is told through 3 different perspectives. The Anne equivalent, the Frederick equivalent, who's called Rico, short for Frederico, and Anne's mother, who in this case isn't in fact dead, although her father is. This has a lot of themes very different from the original Persuasion, including but not limited to domestic violence, maternal abandonment, alcoholism, and suicide.
Okay, so not really Persuasion at all.
Yeah. The Anne equivalent is from an Indian culture, so she obviously has all of these family expectations on her. And the Wentworth equivalent is from Brazil. And because we're seeing it through both his point of view and her point of view, we see the massively turbulent emotions running all the way through it. The next one I read from 2021 is called Where the Rhythm Takes You by Sarah Dass. This one is set on Trinidad, and it's a young adult book, so the characters are much younger. They were together sort of up until the age of about 15, and then there was only a 2-year gap, and they're now 17. The Anne equivalent is still struggling with grief at her mother's death, and so is her father a bit. And so she's been focusing entirely on working for the family hotel. He's become a member of a famous music band. One of the reasons I chose that was because I'm really trying to include some different cultural approaches to it.
And how common is that? People trying to move Jane Austen's 2 different cultures. I mean, in some ways you can see that might be more interesting even than updating it.
It's becoming increasingly common. The next one I read is from 2023, called Much Ado About Nada by Uzma Jalaluddin. This one is set in Canada, but it's within the Muslim community. The Anne and Wentworth equivalents had met intermittently in primary school, then at a high school camp, got together at college, and in this case they actually got married at college but then didn't tell anyone. Anne was 22 when they got together, and there's been a 6-year gap, so she's now 28. They've been separated, but they didn't get divorced, and almost nobody knows that they were married. The context where they get back together is that her best friend is marrying his brother, and there's this massive Muslim conference that his family is involved in organising. In this case, the Mr. Elliot character was introduced very early on because he stole her idea for an app. And I think the equivalent of her getting her bloom back is that she finally has the courage and the determination to instigate proceedings against him for this. Now, the next one, which was published in 2024, is called Once Persuaded, Twice Shy by Melody Edwards. I'd heard about this one on a podcast. I hadn't been planning to read any more, but this one, it's Canadian and it's set with a theatre company. And I thought, it might be like Persuasion meets Slings and Arrows, which is a Canadian TV show about a theatre festival. In fact, it wasn't really. And it's also set in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which we'd been to. So I just thought it would be nice to read.
And how are these published? Are these commercially published or most of them are self-published?
I've got a feeling, to be honest, most of the ones I read have been commercially published.
Yes.
But I'm sure of the 72 books I found listed on Goodreads, some of them were self-published.
Yes.
So in Once Persuaded, Twice Shy, this is another one where they got together at college. And in this case, there's an 8-year gap. This is one where she was persuaded by her mother, this was before her mother's death, persuaded by her mother not to get involved with him because she thought that he was very feckless and undisciplined and unfocused, which was what her father had been like and was still like. But he then did sort of get his act together and got an MBA, and he now runs a venture capital company. And then the very last one, which is actually one of the first published and one that I read ages ago, but it's a little bit different. Published in 2012, it's called For Darkness Shows the Stars by Diana Peter Freund, and it is actually science fiction. It's set in a post-apocalyptic world where genetic experimentation has gone wrong. So there's a very stratified society with the established and exploitative upper classes and the innovative and expanding middle class. And in many ways, this is Persuasion meets John Wyndham's The Chrysalids. It comes after the Hunger Games, which I think started one of the big booms in post-apocalyptic young adult fiction, but this one is more like The Chrysalids. This one has a 4-year gap. They knew each other over quite a few years, finishing when they were 14, and then they come back together when they're both 18. I think because it's written for a young adult market, because honestly they behave much older than 18. And he has actually been out on the equivalent of sea voyaging. They're basically just starting up naval exploration because they've been very isolated. She wrote a sequel book in which they appear briefly that's based on the Scarlet Pimpernel. So those are the books I've read. I would say the ones I enjoyed the most are probably the ones that tried least hard to have a point-for-point matching of everything. So I enjoyed Sonali Dev's Recipe for Persuasion, which had probably the least of all connection because the family dynamics were so completely different and all that sort of thing. I also enjoyed Once Persuaded, Twice Shy, which was the Canadian Theatre Company one, and I enjoyed For Darkness Shows the Stars. But having said that, I sort of finished reading all of these, and then I came back to rereading the last 2 chapters of Persuasion for this episode, and honestly, reading the second last chapter of the book put into perspective all of those adaptations I've just read. I don't regret reading them. Some I might even reread, but they do not stand up to the original. That's why I think I enjoyed most the ones who took it as a starting point, but didn't try to adhere too closely to it. The starting point of all of them, I think, was a love for the original book. And some of them did do some interesting things with it, and I quite enjoyed seeing the parallels, but the more they diverged, the more interesting they became, because the author was basically making their own creation, not just doing a recreation of an existing thing. Yes. And a lot of these can work quite well, but it does really depend on what they're trying to do with it. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
Me, Michael.
And me, Ellen. And now we've finished Persuasion.
I'm sorry there were so many big gaps between episodes. It was entirely my fault for not having time to do the editing.
We'll be reading Northanger Abbey next.
There's going to be a bit of a planned break before that, but we'll get back later this year.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com.
We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us for Northanger Abbey.